This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. Long before fingerprints became the silent witnesses we now consider infallible, the world of crime solving was a chaotic landscape of uncertainty. Investigators relied on the unreliable and the subjective, shaky eyewitness accounts, inconsistent confessions, and circumstantial bits of evidence that could be interpreted in a dozen different ways. Imagine a time when a detective stood over a crime scene with nothing but instinct, intuition, and whatever story the suspect decided to tell. Some criminals were convicted simply because they looked suspicious. Others walked free because they were clever liars. The idea of scientifically proving who touched what, who stood where, or who handled an object was unthinkable. This was the world before fingerprints, a world stumbling in the dark. Before we dive deeper into this journey of how fingerprints changed crime solving forever, make sure you subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. This series is about to travel through history, science, and some of the most fascinating cases ever solved, and you won't want to miss a single part. For centuries, the primary method of identifying criminals involved a strange mix of detective work and guesswork. In many places, officials relied on rudimentary descriptions: height, weight, scars, tattoos, anything that could be written down and filed away, though these descriptions often described hundreds of people. Even photographs, once they became available, were not enough to definitively pinpoint a suspect. Lighting, angles, aging, facial hair, any number of variables could distort an image. And for crimes that involved no direct witnesses, the chance of identifying a culprit dropped to nearly zero. A burglar who managed to slip through a doorway without being seen was, for all practical purposes, a ghost. By the late 1800s, one system attempted to bring order to the chaos: Bertillonage, developed by French criminologist Alphonse Bertillon. This method involved taking precise body measurements: the length of the forearm, the width of the head, the span of the arms, and so on. The idea was that no two people would share the exact same combination of measurements. For a moment, it seemed revolutionary. Police departments across Europe and America embraced the system, creating towering paper archives of measurement cards that cataloged convicted criminals. But Bertillonage had one fatal flaw: many people shared similar measurements. The system was also susceptible to human error. A misread measurement, a sloppy recording, or even a suspect intentionally tensing or relaxing muscles could create inconsistencies. Yet, despite its flaws, it was the first true attempt to bring scientific structure to the messy world of identification. It set the tone for what would come next. The world was searching for something more precise, more permanent, something tied to the individual in a way no disguise or deception could hide. Meanwhile, half a world away, another idea was quietly emerging. British civil servant William Herschel, stationed in India in the mid-1800s, noticed that locals often used handprints as signatures on documents. Out of curiosity, Herschel began collecting handprints and comparing them over time. He found something extraordinary: the patterns never changed. Not after days, months, or years. The lines, whorls, loops, and ridges remained exactly the same. This was more than interesting, it was groundbreaking. Around the same time, a Scottish doctor named Henry Faulds was working in Japan. Faulds observed fingerprints left behind on glass surfaces and pottery and began studying their potential for identification. He realized that each person's patterns were unique. Even more astonishing, fingerprints were incredibly persistent, resistant to age, wear, and even certain injuries. Faulds wrote to British polymath Charles Darwin about his findings, asking for help spreading the idea within scientific circles. Darwin declined but forwarded the letter to his cousin, Francis Galton. Galton would take these early observations and turn them into a scientific foundation. He conducted exhaustive research, analyzing thousands of fingerprints and calculating mathematical probabilities. In 1892, he published Fingerprints, the first book to systematically outline fingerprint classification and the statistical certainty that no two prints were alike. Galton's work provided the credibility the scientific world needed. Fingerprints were no longer curiosities. They were evidence. Yet, science alone doesn't change the world. Adoption requires proof in practice. and the world was about to receive it. In a small village in Argentina in 1892, a brutal double murder rocked the community. A mother, Francisca Rojas, claimed that an intruder had entered her home and killed her 2 children. Investigators were left with only blood, shock, and confusion. But then, a local police official trained in the new fingerprint methods noticed a bloody print on the doorframe, a print that didn't belong to the supposed intruder. When compared against Rojas's fingerprint, the match was undeniable. Confronted with the evidence, she confessed. It was the very first criminal conviction in history based solely on a fingerprint. And it changed everything. As news spread, police departments across the world began reconsidering their reliance on unreliable identification systems. Scotland Yard, which had already been experimenting with bertillonage, quickly realized fingerprints offered something measurements never could: absolute certainty. In 1901, under the leadership of Sir Edward Henry, Scotland Yard officially established its first fingerprint bureau. The transformation was immediate. Criminals who once relied on anonymity were suddenly vulnerable. A smudge on a window, a print on a bottle, a touch on a doorknob, any of these could expose them. More importantly, fingerprints extended beyond the present moment. They allowed investigators to reconnect crimes previously thought unrelated. A burglar arrested in one town could now be linked to crimes committed years earlier in another. As fingerprints entered courtrooms, their credibility grew. Jurors were captivated by the idea of a scientific mark, a pattern no human hand could fake. Defense attorneys struggled to refute the evidence, and judges began to treat fingerprints with the same weight they gave eyewitness testimony, often more. By the early 20th century, the world of crime solving was no longer groping in the dark. Investigators now carried a tool that transcended lies, disguises, and alibis. Fingerprints offered something pure, something forensic, something unalterable. With every print collected, the world stepped closer to a new era of justice. But this was only the beginning. The methods were still crude. Technology was young. Matching fingerprints meant hours of manual comparisons, trained examiners flipping through thousands of index cards, searching for a single ridge pattern that matched. Crime labs were growing, but slowly. New discoveries, new techniques, and new breakthroughs would soon transform fingerprinting into something even more powerful. And as the next chapter of this story unfolds, we'll see how fingerprints evolved from a revolutionary idea into an unstoppable global system, one that would forever change the fate of crime and the criminals who dared leave their mark. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it an investigative revolution. Fingerprints had proven their worth in the courtrooms of Argentina and were beginning to gain respect across Europe, but the world had not yet fully grasped what this discovery meant. The idea that a tiny detail, a swirl or loop pressed invisibly onto a surface, could expose a criminal was almost too extraordinary. Police departments were intrigued, but cautious. Traditional identification methods were deeply ingrained, and many officers trusted instinct over science. Yet slowly, inevitably, fingerprints began rising from curiosity to cornerstone. The most significant catalyst for this shift came from an unlikely place: the administrative offices of British India. Under the guidance of Sir Edward Henry, who was serving as Inspector General of Police in Bengal, fingerprints evolved from a fascinating concept into an organized and practical system. Henry recognized that it wasn't enough to collect prints; they had to be cataloged, classified, and retrieved efficiently. A scientific method without usability would collapse under its own weight. So Henry studied the work of Francis Galton and expanded upon it, developing a classification system that grouped fingerprints by ridge patterns, loops, whorls, and arches. His system allowed thousands of fingerprint records to be sorted and found quickly. This breakthrough became known as the Henry Classification System, and it would define fingerprinting for the next century. By the year 1901, the London Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, officially adopted the Henry system and established its first fingerprint bureau. It began modestly, with only a few officers trained in the craft. But their impact was immediate. Criminals arrested for minor offenses were now fingerprinted and entered into a growing database. Burglars, swindlers, pickpockets, people who once slipped through the cracks, were suddenly identifiable with a single touch point. One of the earliest major triumphs came only months after the Bureau was established. A series of burglaries plagued a neighborhood in South London. The thief left no witnesses and worked silently in the early hours of the morning. Police had little to go on, until one officer found a fingerprint on a freshly painted windowsill. The print was lifted, classified, and compared to Scotland Yard's new database. Within hours, the burglar had a name. Within days, he was in handcuffs. The newspapers called it a miracle of modern detection. Once the public saw its power, fingerprinting spread like wildfire. In the United States, law enforcement agencies watched Europe's developments with interest, but the transition was slow. American policing at the turn of the century still relied heavily on the Bertillon system and political appointees wary of scientific disruption. But change was coming. In 1903, at Leavenworth Penitentiary, the limitations of Bertillonage were exposed in dramatic fashion. Two prisoners, Will West and William West, arrived at the prison within months of each other. They looked nearly identical. Their measurements matched almost exactly. The Bertillon records claimed they were the same man, but they weren't. The mix-up caused an uproar and forced U.S. authorities to confront the truth. The measurement system was flawed. Officials turned to fingerprinting for answers, and when each man's prints were compared, the differences were unmistakable. The incident became legendary in forensic circles. It was, in essence, the moment America surrendered to the superiority of fingerprints. From that point forward, fingerprint identification grew rapidly in the United States. The New York Civil Service Commission was the first agency to adopt fingerprinting in 1902 for applicant verification, ensuring no one applied twice under different names. The New York Police Department soon followed. In 1924, the U.S. Army's fingerprint records were merged with those of the Department of Justice, creating the foundation of the FBI's Fingerprint Division, which would go on to become the largest fingerprint repository in the world. While fingerprints revolutionized crime solving, their integration wasn't merely a legal or bureaucratic change. It altered the psychological landscape of policing. For the first time, investigators felt empowered to challenge suspects with scientific certainty. A smudge on a doorknob or a faint print on a weapon became a voice for the victim, a silent witness that didn't forget, didn't lie, and couldn't be intimidated. But this new era didn't come without challenges. Early fingerprinting required meticulous training. Technicians learned to dust surfaces with finely milled powders, gently lifting prints with clear tape and transferring them to index cards. They practiced rolling inked fingerprints from the edges of a suspect's fingers to capture full ridge detail. Mistakes were common early on. Too much pressure smudged the print. Too little, and the ridges wouldn't show. Some prints overlapped. Others were partial or distorted. Yet, even with these difficulties, the accuracy was undeniable. One of the earliest high-profile cases in which fingerprints played a crucial role occurred in 1905 in the United Kingdom, the Stratton brothers case. Alfred and Albert Stratton were accused of murdering the owner of a paint shop and his wife during a robbery. Investigators found a thumbprint on a cash box at the crime scene, a clear, distinct print. When compared to Alfred Stratton's fingerprint, the match was exact. It was the first time in British history that a murder conviction relied heavily on fingerprint evidence. Newspapers chronicled every detail. The public was fascinated. The scientific era of detective work had arrived, and it was here to stay. As fingerprinting spread, it began influencing more than investigations. It reshaped the very identity of police work. Detectives, once glorified for intuition and street smarts, now needed technical training. Crime labs grew in size and importance. Forensic science units became essential divisions within police departments. Many old-school officers resisted the change at first, uncomfortable with the idea that a piece of powder-covered acetate could speak louder than their instincts. But younger recruits embraced the shift, eager to work with tools that offered precision and authority. By the 1930s, fingerprints were no longer experimental. They were foundational. Police departments in Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America adopted fingerprint bureaus. International conferences were held to standardize techniques. Fingerprint examiners became specialists, respected for their expertise. Some spent entire careers studying ridge characteristics, classification methods, and comparison standards. The world had changed, but the criminals had not. What they didn't realize was that the old rules no longer applied. A single careless touch could now betray them. A drop of sweat, a moment of panic, or a slip of the glove could leave a trail that technology would follow. One burglary case in the 1930s illustrated this perfectly. A thief broke into a wealthy estate, carefully avoiding witnesses and leaving no obvious evidence. He used gloves, avoided glass surfaces, and wiped down doorknobs. But he made one fatal mistake. He removed his gloves for just a moment to pick up a heavy safe door, leaving a perfect fingerprint on the metal edge. When officers lifted the print and searched their growing database, the match came back instantly. The burglar was already known to the police. Within hours, he was arrested. His clever precautions meant nothing in the face of the new forensic reality. By the middle of the 20th century, fingerprints were universally accepted as the gold standard of identification. Courtrooms trusted them. Investigators relied on them. The public believed in them. And criminals feared them. The world's greatest forensic tool had taken its place. But fingerprint science wasn't finished evolving. Technology was advancing, and the next stage would push fingerprints into the digital age, where computers, not humans, would perform matching at incredible speeds, and where databases would expand to hold millions upon millions of prints. By the mid-20th century, fingerprints were already a defining force in forensic work. Police departments across the world had fingerprint bureaus. Courts treated ridge patterns as reliable evidence. And criminals learned, often the hard way, that they could no longer rely on luck or anonymity. Yet as powerful as fingerprints were, the system had one glaring limitation: it depended entirely on human eyes. For decades, examiners worked with magnifying glasses, index cards, and filing cabinets. They memorized thousands of ridge details, recognizing subtle patterns such as bifurcations, ridge endings, short ridges, and islands. Comparing a single suspect's fingerprint against a large database could take days or even weeks. In smaller cases, a slow match was an inconvenience. In larger ones, it meant the trail could go cold before the suspect was even identified. Law enforcement agencies recognized this bottleneck long before they could solve it. As early as the 1940s, American police chiefs and FBI officials wondered if machines could one day catalog fingerprints faster than humans. But the technology wasn't ready. Computers were still experimental, massive, and far too limited to analyze something as detailed as a fingerprint. That changed dramatically in the 1960s. The seeds of digital fingerprint analysis were planted inside the FBI's Identification Division, which by the 1960s housed more than 200 million fingerprint cards. Filing cabinets filled entire floors. Clerks worked day and night to manage, classify, and retrieve prints. The system functioned, but just barely. Every new case added more weight to a system struggling under its own success. The FBI realized that automation was no longer optional. It was essential. Working with scientists and engineers from the National Bureau of Standards, now NIST, the FBI launched early research into computerized image analysis. These pioneers experimented with methods to convert fingerprints into digital data, but the technology was still primitive. They could capture ridge patterns, but isolating distinctive features, the points examiners used for identification, proved difficult. Still, progress came faster than many expected. By the early 1970s, computers became capable of detecting certain ridge characteristics using experimental algorithms. The idea that a machine could independently compare fingerprints was no longer science fiction. It was a looming reality. The breakthrough moment arrived in 1980, when the FBI introduced the first major prototype of an automated fingerprint identification system, known as AFIS. This system could scan fingerprints, convert them into digital images, and search them against a database using mathematical representations of ridge features. AFIS began small. It didn't yet cover the entire national fingerprint collection. In fact, the earliest systems were localized. Each state or city built its own database. Los Angeles, for example, created one of the first functioning AFIS systems in America. Their police department suddenly had a powerful new tool. A fingerprint found on a crime scene no longer required days of comparison. Now, officers could run a search and receive potential matches within minutes. This speed transformed policing. Criminals who once assumed police would never find them suddenly found their identities revealed almost instantly. Cold cases stirred back to life, with new leads generated from long-forgotten prints sitting in evidence rooms. Patterns emerged across state lines, linking crimes previously thought unrelated. But AFIS was only the beginning. As individual states built their own AFIS systems, the FBI worked towards something even more ambitious: a unified national database. In 1999, after years of development, the FBI launched the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. EAFIS. EAFIS represented one of the largest technological undertakings in U.S. law enforcement history. It housed more than 70 million criminal fingerprint records, plus millions more civilian prints from background checks, military service, and federal employment. The system could process a fingerprint query in less than half an hour, a monumental improvement over the old manual method. This was not merely a step forward, it was a leap. Forensic examiners now had access to a network connecting federal, state, and local agencies. A print recovered from a homicide in Chicago could be matched to someone arrested for burglary in Florida within the same day. The boundaries between police jurisdictions began to fade, replaced by a seamless digital infrastructure. Despite popular belief, computerized fingerprint matching doesn't work like magic. The machine doesn't see fingerprints the way humans do. Instead, it uses a mathematical approach. When an image is scanned into the system, software identifies key features, called minutiae points, including ridge endings, bifurcations, deltas, core patterns, ridge intersections. The system measures the spatial relationship between these points, converting the fingerprint into a digital template. It then searches for templates with similar structures. The result isn't a single match, but a list of candidates, ranked by probability. From there, trained human examiners take over. Humans still make the final call, and for good reason. Even the most advanced algorithms can struggle with smudged, partial, or distorted prints. A fingerprint left on a dusty shelf or sweaty door handle rarely comes out perfectly. It's the combination of human expertise and machine power that ensures reliability. As digital systems grew more accurate, fingerprints became the key to solving crimes once deemed hopeless. Evidence rooms across the country were filled with boxes of unsolved cases, many holding fingerprint lifts collected long before AFIS existed. With the new technology, forensic technicians began reanalyzing these prints. In case after case, forgotten fingerprints led investigators straight to long elusive suspects. One notable example involved a series of home invasions that plagued a Midwestern town in the 1980s. At the time, police lifted a partial print from a window frame but couldn't match it manually. The case went cold for decades. In the mid-2000s, the print was re-entered into AFIS, and within minutes, the system generated a likely match. The suspect, now living states away, was arrested and confessed. Stories like this weren't rare. They became increasingly common. Fingerprints, once limited by human speed and scale, now reached across decades and geography. While the United States built EAFIS, other countries created their own national systems. Eventually, international cooperation followed. Interpol developed a global fingerprint database enabling law enforcement agencies worldwide to share and compare prints. This collaboration became vital in combating international crime, from human trafficking to terrorism to worldwide drug operations. The world had moved from dusty ink pads to digital networks connecting millions of records. By the 2010s, fingerprint databases expanded far beyond traditional inked cards. Many systems incorporated live-scan fingerprinting, palm prints, partial latent prints, advanced algorithms capable of analyzing low-quality images. Computers became so sophisticated that they could detect similarities unseen by the human eye, especially in smudged or fragmentary prints. The FBI upgraded EAFIS to something even more powerful, the Next Generation Identification System, NGI. This system didn't just store fingerprints. It combined multiple forms of biometric data, including facial recognition, iris scans, palm prints, and even voice analysis. Fingerprints remained a core component, but now they operated within a digital ecosystem of identity. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, fingerprints had seeped into everyday life in ways early pioneers could never have imagined. People logged into their smartphones with their fingerprints. They passed through immigration checkpoints using biometric kiosks. Employers used fingerprint scanners for secure access. Even time cards in offices shifted to biometric verification. Yet despite fingerprints becoming commonplace in technology, their role in crime solving remains unique, powerful, and undisputed. They continue to solve cases at every level, from petty theft to complex homicide. Because ridge patterns remain stable, unique, and enduring. The digital revolution of fingerprinting represents one of the most significant shifts in forensic history. It freed investigators from the limits of manual searching, connected agencies across borders, and breathed life into long-forgotten cases. But the story isn't finished. By the time fingerprint databases went digital and systems like AFIS and EAFIS became standard worldwide, fingerprints had fully transformed from a forensic method into a core part of modern identity. But in the late 20th century, and especially the early 21st, fingerprints expanded far beyond police investigations. They migrated into commercial security, digital authentication, border control, workplace systems, and even the devices people carry in their pockets every day. This part explores how fingerprints shifted from a tool used primarily by governments and law enforcement into one of the most widely adopted forms of personal identification on Earth. And how this shift changed both crime solving and daily life in ways few early fingerprint pioneers could have predicted. Long before smartphones introduced fingerprint sensors, companies and governments were already experimenting with biometric identification systems for everyday use. In high-security facilities, fingerprints replaced access cards. In some workplaces, employees clocked in using biometric terminals rather than punch cards. These early systems were clunky and slow, often requiring multiple attempts to verify prints. Still, they demonstrated a fundamental truth: fingerprints were reliable, convenient, and nearly impossible to forge. What changed everything was the rapid miniaturization of sensors. Engineers learned how to place tiny capacitive or optical readers into small chips. These chips captured ridge patterns with enough clarity for dependable verification. By the early 2000s, the stage was set for a consumer revolution in fingerprint technology. In 2013, Apple introduced Touch ID on the iPhone 5S. While fingerprint scanners had existed on laptops and some early smartphones, none had achieved mainstream success. Touch ID changed that overnight. It was fast, accurate, and seamlessly integrated into daily use. Within seconds, users could unlock devices, authorize purchases, or sign into accounts simply by touching a sensor. This marked a turning point. Suddenly, fingerprints weren't just something police collected or security officers scanned. They became part of a global digital lifestyle. Billions of people started using fingerprints countless times each day, often without thinking about it. Android manufacturers quickly followed with their own fingerprint authentication systems. What was once exceptional became ordinary. But the adoption of fingerprint scanning in consumer tech had unexpected side effects for law enforcement. As people grew accustomed to fingerprint sensors on phones, tablets, and laptops, public understanding of fingerprints became more nuanced. No longer were fingerprints mysterious forensic evidence known only from crime dramas. They became personal, something individuals interacted with constantly. This familiarity made jurors more comfortable accepting fingerprint evidence in court, not because they understood the science deeply, but because they recognized fingerprints as reliable, intimate identifiers. At the same time, the widespread use of fingerprint sensors produced enormous amounts of biometric data stored in secure environments, such as corporate databases or encrypted devices. This sometimes created legal tensions. Investigators occasionally sought access to a suspect's phone using fingerprint unlocking. Courts around the world debated whether fingerprints, as physical characteristics, fell under the same legal protections as written passcodes. Some courts ruled that compelling someone to unlock a device with their fingerprint was permissible. Others disagreed, treating biometric data as equivalent to a password. This legal ambiguity revealed an uncomfortable truth. Fingerprints were no longer just forensic tools, they had become gateways to entire digital identities. While smartphones normalized the idea of everyday biometric use, governments quietly adopted fingerprinting in ways that reshaped international travel. Border control agencies began using fingerprint readers to verify passports, check watch lists, and confirm the identities of visa applicants. Many countries integrated fingerprints into biometric passports, which stored digital fingerprint data in a secure chip. This development had two major impacts. It made identity fraud far more difficult. Forged passports could imitate images and text, but reproducing fingerprints was much harder. It created enormous global biometric databases. Some of these databases were shared between countries or linked to international crime-fighting organizations such as Interpol. These fingerprint systems weren't strictly about security at borders. They also contributed to criminal identification. A traveler flagged at customs might be linked to crimes committed years before in another country, simply because his fingerprints matched a dormant print in an international database. By the 2010s, fingerprints were common in workplaces, schools, and public facilities. Companies used fingerprint scanners for secure door access, replacing traditional keycards that were easily lost or stolen. Some school systems adopted fingerprint scanners for library checkouts, lunch payments, and student attendance. This mainstreaming of fingerprint technology brought new debates. Parents questioned privacy. Employees raised concerns about data storage and potential misuse. Legislators began writing laws requiring companies to protect biometric data with stronger safeguards than those used for ordinary information. These concerns were not unfounded. While fingerprints cannot be stolen, in the traditional sense, ridge patterns remain on fingers regardless. Digital fingerprint templates stored in insecure databases could be compromised. Fortunately, most modern systems store fingerprints as abstract mathematical models, not actual images, making reconstruction extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the ubiquity of fingerprint scanning forced society to reconsider how personal identity should be protected in an age where fingerprints were used everywhere. As fingerprints entered everyday life, most criminals remained aware that leaving behind prints was risky. What many didn't realize was how dramatically technology had improved in analyzing poor quality prints. A smudged print on a window or a partial fingerprint on a soda can could lead directly to a suspect through modern AFIS systems. Moreover, the expansion of civilian fingerprint databases, from job applications, background checks, military records, visa applications, and immigration documents, meant that far more people had fingerprints stored in secure systems. Even criminals who had never been arrested might appear in a database simply because they applied for certain licenses or government services. Criminals responded with gloves, wipes, and amateur efforts to avoid leaving traces. Some even attempted to use fake fingerprints or burn their fingertips. These methods rarely worked. Burns often left unique scars, which could still be matched. Fake fingerprints were easily detected by trained examiners or electronic sensors. Technology had tipped the scales heavily in favor of investigators. As fingerprints became universal identifiers, a philosophical tension emerged. Who owns your biometric data? Who should have access to it? Should fingerprints collected for non-criminal purposes appear in law enforcement searches? What happens if a database is breached? Some governments assured citizens that fingerprints collected for passports or driver's licenses would not be shared with police except under court order. Others created integrated systems openly used for criminal identification. Advocates of privacy argued that fingerprints, unlike passwords, cannot be changed if compromised. Advocates of security countered that fingerprints were already used safely for over a century in law enforcement, and now provided faster, more accurate protection in everyday life. This debate continues today, shaping technology policy worldwide. By the early 21st century, fingerprints had achieved a dual identity. They were still the bedrock of forensic investigation, stable, unique, and irreplaceable. But they had also become a central component of digital life, granting access to phones, buildings, databases, and border crossings. This convergence of forensic science and everyday technology dramatically expanded the role fingerprints play in solving crimes. Investigators gained more tools, more databases, and more clarity. Criminals had fewer places to hide. And society entered a new era where a simple touch of a fingertip could open doors, unlock devices, or solve cases that once seemed impossible. By the time fingerprints became embedded in everyday life, unlocking phones, verifying passports, controlling access to buildings, they had acquired a reputation as an almost perfect science. For over a century, fingerprints were seen as the gold standard of forensic identification, a method that seemed unshakable, precise, and beyond dispute. But as fingerprint technology strengthened its grip on modern policing, questions began to emerge. Some came from defense attorneys, others from forensic experts, and still others from innocent people caught in the system. Fingerprints were powerful, yes, but they were not magic. They were not infallible. And the belief that they were flawless led to some of the most dramatic mistakes in modern forensic history. During the late 20th century and early 2000s, several high-profile cases began to chip away at the assumption that fingerprint evidence was unassailable. These cases did not invalidate fingerprints as a forensic tool. Instead, they revealed something far more human. Systems built on human interpretation are always vulnerable to human error. And when those systems are trusted without question, the consequences can be profound. The story of fingerprint fallibility begins with an uncomfortable truth. For more than 100 years, fingerprint matching was performed not by machines, but by experts examining tiny ridge patterns under magnifying glasses. These experts were highly trained, dedicated, and skilled. But they were still people, subject to pressure, fatigue, bias, and expectation. When an examiner looked at a print knowing the police's preferred suspect, the subconscious influence could be enormous. A smudged ridge might suddenly look clearer. A broken line might appear connected. A curve might seem to match a similar curve on another print. These are the quiet, invisible errors that never appear in scientific textbooks but happen in real-world forensic laboratories. Perhaps the most famous example of fingerprint error emerged in 1997, involving a man named Brandon Mayfield in Oregon. Mayfield, an attorney and former Army officer, had never been to Spain. Yet when Spanish officials investigated the deadly Madrid train bombings in 2004, they found a fingerprint on a bag of detonators. The print was submitted to the FBI, which ran it through its newly expanded IAFIS system. The computer produced several potential matches, but human examiners zeroed in on Mayfield. They believed the similarity was undeniable. It wasn't. Spanish authorities later confirmed the print belonged to someone else entirely. Mayfield was arrested, held for weeks, and placed under intense suspicion, based solely on an erroneous fingerprint match. The FBI later admitted the mistake and issued a public apology. The case made headlines worldwide, raising uncomfortable questions about a system that had long been treated as irrefutable. But this was not an isolated incident. In fact, history is filled with lesser-known cases of mistaken fingerprint identification. Many involved partial prints, blurred impressions, or prints lifted from textured surfaces. These prints were far more difficult to analyze than the crisp, fully formed prints often depicted on police shows. Yet even imperfect prints sometimes made their way into courtrooms, where prosecutors presented them as conclusive evidence. The Mayfield case forced forensic science to confront a truth it had avoided for decades. Fingerprint analysis was not an exact science. It relied heavily on judgment. Expert judgment, yes, but judgment nonetheless. The reliability of fingerprint matches depended not only on the uniqueness of ridge patterns, but also on the training and objectivity of the examiner, the quality of the print, and the working conditions inside the lab. This revelation led to long overdue reforms. Laboratories strengthened their accreditation standards. Many introduced blind verification procedures, meaning a second examiner reviewed fingerprint comparisons without knowing the first examiner's conclusion. The FBI updated its internal protocols. Academic researchers began studying the psychology of forensic decision-making, exploring how expectations and context can shape what an examiner thinks they see. Ironically, the technological shift toward digital databases, which had once raised concerns about depersonalizing forensic science, ended up helping reduce errors. Automated fingerprint systems could compare tens of thousands of ridge patterns without fatigue or bias. They could generate lists of possible candidates without caring about police theories or investigative pressure. Of course, humans were still required to confirm any match. But the combination of algorithmic searching and structured human review proved far safer than the fully manual methods of earlier decades. Still, the very existence of fingerprint mistakes opened a deeper debate, one that touched the core of forensic science. Fingerprints had been portrayed to juries for decades as absolute. Prosecutors often used phrases like, "a positive identification," or "a perfect match." Television crime dramas only reinforced this perception. But the real world was more complicated. Scientists knew fingerprints were unique, but the certainty of a match depended heavily on the clarity of the print and the judgment of the examiner. Some researchers argued that fingerprints should be presented in court with more nuance, acknowledging uncertainty. Others worried that too much doubt would undermine a tool that had helped solve countless crimes. These debates didn't diminish the power of fingerprints. Instead, they made the field more honest. The forensic community began moving toward transparency, embracing the idea that acknowledging limitations strengthens science rather than weakens it. As a result, many fingerprint examiners today speak more carefully about their conclusions, avoiding absolute language. Courts, too, have become more aware of the need for safeguards, requiring clearer explanations of methodology and sometimes allowing cross-examination on issues like print quality and potential bias. Even as these reforms unfolded, fingerprints continued evolving in ways that surprised many experts. The rise of digital forensics created new challenges. Criminals increasingly used gloves during physical crimes, but left fingerprints all over their digital lives. Online accounts, smartphone apps, and secure devices stored biometric authentication data. Investigators sometimes found themselves navigating legal battles to access a suspect's fingerprint-locked phone, battles that reflected a broader tension between privacy rights and criminal investigations. Meanwhile, technological breakthroughs began pushing fingerprints into uncharted territory. Researchers developed advanced imaging systems capable of capturing minute ridge details invisible to the naked eye. Others experimented with chemical reagents that could develop prints long thought unrecoverable, including on porous or degraded surfaces. Some scientists even explored touch DNA, a technique that retrieves genetic material from areas where prints were left, adding another layer of identification. These innovations expanded what was possible but also introduced new complexities. Courts had to evaluate not only traditional fingerprint comparisons but also chemical and digital enhancements that required specialized expertise. Investigators had access to more tools than ever before but had to ensure those tools were used responsibly, transparently, and consistently. All of this reflected a broader truth: fingerprint science had matured. It had moved beyond the uncritical enthusiasm of its early days. It had survived scandals, adapted to new technologies, and weathered legal scrutiny. And through all of it, fingerprints remained a cornerstone of crime solving, not because they were perfect, but because they were powerful, resilient, and deeply tied to human identity. As the 21st century progressed, one final transformation lay ahead. Fingerprints were no longer just patterns of ridges and whorls. They were becoming part of a larger forensic ecosystem, linked to digital records, biological evidence, and vast international databases. By the early 21st century, fingerprints were no longer merely a forensic tool. They had become an essential component of global security. What began as a method for solving crimes had evolved into a system of international cooperation, digital databases, biometric passports, and real-time identity verification. In a world shaped by globalization, mass migration, and increasingly sophisticated criminal networks, fingerprints transformed from static ridges on a fingertip into a universal language spoken across borders. This transformation did not happen overnight. Instead, it unfolded through a series of innovations, policy changes, and international agreements that gradually expanded fingerprint usage far beyond local police stations. The evolution was driven by both necessity and opportunity. Criminals were becoming more mobile, more connected, and more adept at exploiting loopholes between jurisdictions. Nations realized they needed tools that allowed them to communicate as quickly and effectively as criminals did. Fingerprints, with their promise of uniqueness and permanence, were the ideal bridge point. One of the most important developments came with the creation of international fingerprint databases, systems designed to share identification data across countries. Interpol, for example, built a vast fingerprint repository that member nations could access, allowing police agencies to compare prints found at crime scenes with potential suspects from around the world. This marked a monumental shift. For the first time in history, a fingerprint left on a doorknob in Germany could identify a suspect living in Brazil. A smudged print recovered from a passport in Singapore could reveal a fugitive who vanished from American law enforcement decades earlier. These global systems reshaped criminal investigations. Stories quickly emerged showing just how powerful they could be. A burglar who fled from New York to Eastern Europe was tracked down because his prints were automatically scanned against multiple databases when he was arrested for a minor offense abroad. An unidentified drowning victim in Southeast Asia was linked to a missing person case in Canada after local authorities submitted her fingerprints for international comparison. Human trafficking rings, drug cartels, and organized crime groups, all of them suddenly faced a world where hiding across borders became significantly more difficult. Yet fingerprints were not just important in criminal investigations. Governments worldwide began integrating biometric identification into everyday life. Many countries introduced biometric passports, which stored fingerprint data alongside a digital photo and embedded chip. This allowed customs officers to verify a traveler's identity instantly, reducing the risk of forged documents. Airports installed automated border control gates where travelers could simply place a finger on a scanner and pass through. Some nations required fingerprints for national ID cards, driver's licenses, or immigration applications. These advancements added layers of security, but also sparked debates about privacy and civil liberties. Critics argued that storing millions of fingerprints in government databases could lead to misuse, whether intentional or accidental. Supporters responded that such systems were essential in a world where identity theft and document fraud were rampant. The tension between safety and privacy became a central theme in the ongoing evolution of biometric technologies. At the heart of this debate was a fundamental question: who controls our fingerprints? Once fingerprints transitioned from police evidence to everyday identification, governments and organizations had to create strict rules governing access, storage, and usage. In many countries, forensic labs and immigration authorities were required to maintain separate databases, ensuring that fingerprints collected for visas could not be automatically compared with fingerprints from crime scenes without due legal process. Other countries adopted more integrated systems, arguing that closed data silos only helped criminals. Despite these differing approaches, the global trend was clear. Fingerprints were becoming part of a broader biometric identity network, an interconnected system designed to authenticate, monitor, and track individuals in ways previously unimaginable. As technological advances continued, the science of fingerprint identification experienced another turning point. This time, the revolution came in the form of multimodal biometrics, systems that combined fingerprints with other forms of identification, such as iris patterns, face recognition, and even voice prints. These systems were not built solely to replace fingerprints but to complement them. Each biometric had strengths and weaknesses. Fingerprints were easy to collect but could occasionally be damaged or obscured by dirt or injuries. Iris scans were extremely precise but required specialized equipment. Face recognition was fast but could be affected by lighting, aging, or disguises. By combining multiple biometrics, law enforcement agencies dramatically increased accuracy. Refugee registration systems, border control programs, and large-scale government identification projects adopted multimodal identification to prevent duplicate identities, fraud, and exploitation. For instance, some countries used fingerprint plus iris systems to verify welfare recipients, reducing fraud and ensuring benefits went to the right individuals. Others used multimodal biometrics to track voter registration, preventing duplicate or fake registrations in national elections. This integration also influenced traditional policing. Detectives could now cross-reference fingerprints with digital surveillance footage. If a partial print from a crime scene did not produce a match, investigators might scan video recordings from nearby streets and run facial recognition software. In some cases, fingerprints unlocked a suspect's locked phone, which then provided GPS data, messages, or photos that completed the investigative puzzle. The modern forensic landscape was increasingly interconnected, with fingerprints acting as the anchor point linking physical evidence to digital clues. However, as these capabilities grew, so did the challenges. The more data that existed, the more complex the systems became. False matches and face recognition technology raised concerns about racial bias and reliability. Biometric spoofing, attempts to fool scanners with artificial or altered fingerprints, emerged as a new threat. Criminals experimented with surgical fingerprint alterations, superglue coatings, and even implanted skin grafts to obscure their identity. In response, scientists developed advanced liveness detection technologies, sensors capable of verifying whether a fingerprint belonged to a living human finger rather than a replica. These sensors could detect blood flow, skin elasticity, and even subtle electrical conductivity. Combined with high-resolution imaging, they made fingerprint scanners much harder to deceive. Law enforcement agencies also invested in latent print enhancement techniques, including laser-based imaging, chemical vapor deposition, and nanoscale powders capable of revealing fingerprints on surfaces previously thought impossible, like fabrics, human skin, or submerged objects. These innovations allowed investigators to recover evidence even in challenging environments. As fingerprints entered their second century of forensic use, their continued relevance became undeniable. Despite newer biometrics emerging, fingerprints retained a unique role. They were accessible, inexpensive, and deeply embedded in global security infrastructure. Most importantly, they linked the digital world with the physical. A fingerprint was both biological and technological. It was something a person carried everywhere yet could be encoded, indexed, and analyzed through sophisticated software. And as global crime evolved into cybercrime, human trafficking, and transnational networks, fingerprints remained one of the few identifiers that criminals could not easily hide, hack, or change. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, fingerprint science entered a period of transformation unlike anything seen before. Until then, fingerprints had been understood primarily as markers of identity, unique biological signatures that distinguished one person from another. But new research, combined with rapid technological innovation, began to reveal something incredible. Fingerprints could provide far more information than identity alone. They could uncover the chemical traces of a person's life, the environmental conditions they had been exposed to, and even clues about recent actions. A fingerprint was no longer merely a pattern, it was becoming a miniature forensic diary. This shift was fueled by advances in chemical analysis, especially techniques like mass spectrometry, Raman spectroscopy, and infrared imaging. Scientists discovered that the residue left behind in a fingerprint contained far more than oils and sweat. Embedded in those ridges were microscopic particles of drugs, explosives, cosmetics, food, metal residue, DNA fragments, and metabolites produced by the body. Each print was like a chemical snapshot of a moment in time. One of the first major breakthroughs came when researchers demonstrated that fingerprints could reveal drug usage. Not just whether someone had touched drugs, but whether they had ingested them. Metabolites of cocaine, heroin, and other substances seeped through the pores and were detectable in fingerprint residue. This allowed police and medical professionals to perform rapid drug tests that were impossible to fake. Someone who touched drugs could wash their hands and potentially remove most residue. But someone who had consumed drugs excreted trace metabolites through their fingertips no matter how thoroughly they washed. This capability had far-reaching implications. It meant that fingerprints could help investigators understand the lifestyle of suspects, detect whether drugs were handled during a crime, or differentiate between a casual touch and active involvement. Courts began to see cases where fingerprints were used not only to place someone at a scene but to show patterns of behavior leading up to the event. Another groundbreaking discovery involved the ability to determine a fingerprint's age. For over a century, forensic investigators struggled with the question: How long has this fingerprint been here? A fingerprint could potentially last weeks, months, or years under the right conditions. But determining when it was deposited was notoriously difficult. New technologies changed that. By analyzing the breakdown of certain chemical compounds in fingerprint residue, such as cholesterol, fatty acids, and amino acids, scientists learned to estimate the age of a print with increasing accuracy. This allowed investigators to distinguish fresh prints from old ones, helping establish timelines. A fingerprint found on a window frame could now tell police whether it was left during the burglary or months earlier. In investigations where multiple suspects had legitimate reasons to be in a location, age estimation became a powerful filtering tool. Even more astonishing was the discovery that fingerprints might reveal emotional states. Research showed that stress altered the composition of sweat, changing the chemical signature left in a print. Stress hormones, particularly cortisol, could appear in trace amounts. While still an emerging field with limitations, early studies suggested that fingerprints could one day help determine whether a person was under duress or experiencing heightened emotion at the time they touched a surface. This type of insight could transform how interrogations, crime reconstructions, or victim analysis are conducted. Meanwhile, technological advancements were reshaping the fingerprint images themselves. Traditional 2D fingerprint scanners, whether optical, capacitive, or thermal, had long been the standard. But the development of 3D fingerprint imaging marked a leap into the future. These devices captured depth, pore structure, ridge height, and even the sweat gland openings. Pores, once largely ignored, became crucial forensic markers. Their distribution was found to be just as unique as ridge patterns, adding a new layer of identification accuracy. 3D imaging offered several advantages. First, it significantly reduced errors caused by pressure distortion. When someone presses their finger on a flat scanner, the ridges flatten and distort. In real crime scenes, latent prints also appear distorted depending on the angle and surface. 3D technology allowed investigators to reconstruct the finger's actual shape, correcting distortions and improving match accuracy. It also made it harder for criminals to spoof prints using molds or artificial replicas. Fake prints lacked the depth and pore structure captured by 3D scanners, making them easier to detect. Parallel to these hardware advancements, artificial intelligence began playing a transformative role. Traditional fingerprint matching relied heavily on minutiae points, ridge endings, and bifurcations. While effective, this method had limitations, especially with partial or smudged prints. AI, however, excelled at recognizing patterns even in fragmented data. Machine learning algorithms could analyze ridge flow, pore patterns, microscopic textures, and distortions with remarkable precision. AI-based systems also allowed for probabilistic matching, an approach that estimated the likelihood that two prints originated from the same finger rather than delivering a simple yes/no result. This helped forensic analysts quantify uncertainty, which in turn strengthened the credibility of fingerprint evidence in courtrooms. Instead of simply claiming a match, analysts could present statistical evidence supporting their conclusion. Another benefit of AI was its ability to merge data from different sources. For instance, a partial print from a crime scene could be digitally combined with a print from a previous arrest to reconstruct missing areas. The system could also compare prints faster than ever before. What once took days or weeks could now be completed in seconds. This speed was invaluable in urgent investigations like kidnappings, terrorism cases, or active crimes where rapid identification could save lives. As fingerprint science expanded, so did its applications. One area where fingerprints made a surprising impact was in human trafficking investigations. Traffickers often force victims to use false identities, but fingerprints allowed law enforcement to track movement across borders, identify missing persons, and dismantle trafficking networks. Victims without documentation, sometimes stripped of identification by traffickers, could use fingerprints to confirm who they were and reunite with families. In the corporate world, fingerprints helped secure sensitive facilities, protect intellectual property, and authenticate high-level access. But as the technology became more accessible, cybercriminals sought ways to exploit it. High-resolution photos, lifted prints, and digital replicas created new challenges. This led to the rise of biometric encryption, in which a fingerprint wasn't stored as an image but as a mathematical representation. Even if a hacker stole the data, they could not reverse engineer the fingerprint. Some companies went further, integrating fingerprints into multi-factor authentication with behavioral biometrics. These systems didn't just verify the ridges, they analyzed how a person touched a device, the pressure, rhythm, angle, and speed. These subtleties were nearly impossible to replicate. As fingerprint technology advanced, legal systems struggled to keep pace. Law enforcement agencies had to clarify how fingerprint data could be collected, stored, and shared. Courts debated the admissibility of AI-generated matches and probabilistic evidence. Privacy advocates voiced concerns about the potential misuse of biometric data, especially as governments expanded national ID systems. The conversation around fingerprints became part of a broader debate about digital rights, surveillance, and the balance between security and freedom. Yet, despite the challenges, fingerprints remained a cornerstone of forensic science. They adapted, expanded, and integrated into new technologies, proving their resilience and versatility. By the time forensic science entered the 2020s, fingerprints had evolved from static patterns into dynamic sources of biological, chemical, and behavioral information. But the innovations didn't stop there. Researchers around the world continued uncovering new ways to extract meaning from the residue left behind by fingertips. Their discoveries transformed fingerprints into powerful forensic tools that extended far beyond traditional crime solving. In Part 8, the story turns toward the cutting-edge developments that blurred the line between biology, technology, and chemistry, and the unexpected ways fingerprints revealed the unseen layers of a person's life. One of the most transformative discoveries involved the ability to determine a person's health condition based on fingerprint residue. While fingerprints had long been used to determine identity, scientists realized that the sebaceous and sweat secretions in ridge patterns contained biomarkers, substances that indicated metabolic processes, hormone changes, even early signs of disease. In hospitals and forensic labs alike, researchers began analyzing fingerprints for indicators of diabetes, cancer, and infectious diseases. For example, studies found that people with type 2 diabetes had elevated levels of certain ketone-related compounds in their sweat. Cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy produced distinct chemical signatures that could be detected in fingerprint residue. Even viral infections left trace metabolic changes detectable through emerging spectrochemical methods. Though fingerprint testing was not intended to replace medical diagnostics, it opened the door to health data playing a role in forensic timelines, helping investigators understand whether a suspect was under medical treatment, physically impaired, or affected by substances at the time of a crime. Another area of rapid development was environmental fingerprinting. Scientists discovered that fingerprints absorbed microscopic particles from the surrounding environment: dust, pollen, pollutants, metals, and even soil-specific minerals unique to geographic regions. Each fingerprint could reveal where a person had recently been. For instance, fingerprints left by someone who walked through a construction site might contain traces of gypsum or silica dust. Those who had been near the ocean carried salt crystals and microscopic organic fragments. Urban environments left metallic pollutants, while rural ones left pollen or agricultural chemicals. This gave investigators a new forensic dimension. A finger's trail could reveal a person's movement before a crime. Scientists could determine whether someone had been in a wooded area, a factory, a polluted city, or near explosives, all based on what their fingerprints carried. It wasn't proof in itself but became a powerful supplemental tool, adding context when timelines were unclear. At the same time, wearable technology and consumer electronics were reshaping everyday fingerprint use. Fingerprint sensors appeared on smartphones, laptops, smart locks, vehicles, and even payment terminals. This widespread adoption created a complex relationship between privacy and security. Millions of people relied on fingerprints as digital keys, but these digital keys could not be changed if compromised. Unlike a password, a fingerprint follows a person for life. This risk sparked the development of next-generation fingerprint encryption, a method that transformed a fingerprint into a one-way, unrecoverable code. Instead of storing an actual fingerprint image, systems stored mathematical representations derived from complex algorithms. Even if a cybercriminal obtained the encrypted code, they couldn't reconstruct the original fingerprint. This innovation was crucial because data breaches were becoming more common, and fingerprints needed stronger protection than ever before. Still, the increasing reliance on fingerprints in everyday life created new opportunities and risks in criminal investigations. Law enforcement agencies found themselves asking new questions. Should digital fingerprint data from smartphones be used in criminal cases? Should it be obtained with warrants? What about shared devices or workplaces where fingerprints were required for access? The legal landscape had to adapt to a world where fingerprints were not just found at crime scenes but embedded in nearly every digital interaction. While legal scholars debated these issues, scientists were pushing fingerprint identification into areas once thought impossible. One of the most striking innovations was the ability to recreate partial fingerprints with unprecedented accuracy. Traditionally, a partial print, just a smudge or a fragment, was difficult to match. But AI systems trained on millions of fingerprint images could now predict the missing portions, reconstructing prints with a high degree of accuracy. This advancement greatly improved cold case investigations. Old fingerprints once considered unusable were fed into AI systems, revealing matches previously undetectable. Some long unsolved cases were reopened as new leads emerged from improved print interpretations. Forensic labs saw a surge in requests to reanalyze decades-old evidence, giving new hope to victims' families. Another surprising field where fingerprints gained traction was historical forensics. Scientists analyzed fingerprints left on ancient pottery, old documents, or artifacts to learn about the people who created them. Patterns suggested age ranges, biological sex, and even the tools used in crafting. In some cases, fingerprints on old paintings revealed which sections were created by apprentices rather than master artists. Though far removed from modern crime solving, these discoveries deepened the understanding of fingerprints as universal human markers across time. While these advancements were celebrated, they came with intense debate. Some ethicists warned that fingerprints were becoming too revealing. The idea that a single fingerprint could expose health conditions, lifestyle factors, or emotional states raised concerns about privacy and discrimination. Could employers misuse fingerprint data to screen for illnesses? Could governments track citizens' movements through environmental residue in prints? Could insurance companies use fingerprint biomarkers to deny coverage? To prevent these dystopian possibilities, international discussions emerged around biometric ethics, guidelines that would govern how fingerprint data could be collected, analyzed, stored, and shared. Privacy advocates argue for strict limitations, while law enforcement emphasized the importance of using technology responsibly to solve crimes. Despite the debates, one thing was clear: fingerprints were no longer simple identifiers. They had evolved into multidimensional forensic tools with profound implications. Meanwhile, everyday policing continued to benefit from practical innovations. Portable fingerprint scanners became smaller and more capable, allowing officers to identify individuals in seconds during field operations. These handheld devices could scan wet, dirty, or smudged fingerprints that traditional devices struggled with. Firefighters used them to identify victims of disasters. Border officials used them to detect forged passports and uncover individuals traveling under aliases. In forensic labs, researchers explored nanotechnology to reveal fingerprints invisible to the naked eye. Nanoparticles that adhered to specific chemical components in prints made faint patterns glow under specialized lighting. These techniques allowed investigators to find prints on fabrics, bodies, submerged objects, or burned surfaces, places once thought impossible. Each new discovery built upon the last. Fingerprints continued evolving from physical impressions to complex biochemical records. The more scientists uncovered, the more fingerprints became portals into a person's recent actions, biology, habits, and environment. By the time fingerprint science entered its newest frontier, investigators had begun to realize they were dealing with something far more complex than a pattern of loops and whorls. What had started as a method to identify individuals in dusty 19th century police stations had expanded into an entire ecosystem of identity: physical, digital, biological, and behavioral. In Part 9, we move into a space where forensic science and cybersecurity intersect, where fingerprints no longer live solely at crime scenes but in the circuitry of everyday digital life. The rise of smartphone biometrics created a shift unlike anything fingerprint analysts had witnessed before. Millions of people unlock their phones simply by touching a sensor. Grocery purchases, mobile banking, work logins, even door locks relied less on codes and more on the ridges of a fingertip. This created a strange new environment, a world where people voluntarily handed over their fingerprints every time they checked a text or bought a coffee. To cybersecurity experts, this was both a marvel and a risk. Unlike passwords, fingerprints could not be changed. If compromised, they stayed compromised. But that wasn't the only challenge. Fingerprint sensors were designed not for forensic precision but for familiarity, speed, and convenience. They didn't capture full prints, just small, unique segments. These segments were then converted into encrypted templates, mathematical representations stored deep inside a device's secure hardware. For the average consumer, this was invisible. For investigators, it created a puzzle. Could those encrypted templates ever be used in a criminal case? Should they? What if a suspect's device held fingerprint data linking them to other crimes? Courts struggled with these questions. Some cases argued that forcing someone to unlock a phone with a fingerprint violated the right against self-incrimination. Others insisted it was no different from handing over a key. Technology advanced faster than the legal system, leaving judges with decisions that affected the very definition of personal privacy. Slowly, laws shifted to treat biometric unlocking differently from typed passwords, but no universal standard emerged. Across countries, the rules varied, an uneasy patchwork created in response to a world where every citizen carried a biometric gateway in their pocket. Meanwhile, forensic scientists pushed deeper into how fingerprints interacted with digital ecosystems. Criminals who once tried to wipe surfaces clean now had to contend with a completely new problem: digital residue. Every time someone touched a fingerprint sensor, the device stored tiny fragments of data about ridge alignment, direction, and minutiae. These weren't full prints, but in some investigations, they became supplementary evidence. If two devices were used by the same person, investigators could compare the mathematical fingerprint templates, not to identify the person, but to determine whether the same fingerprint had been used on both devices. In cases involving stolen phones, fraudulent transactions, or social engineering schemes, this technique became unexpectedly valuable. Yet the most dramatic evolution came from the rise of behavioral biometrics. Scientists realized that fingerprints were only part of the story. The way a person touched a screen, the pressure, angle, speed, rhythm, created a behavioral signature as unique as the fingerprint itself. Algorithms could recognize users not only by their fingerprint, but by how they used that fingerprint. Some phones quietly incorporated this into fraud detection systems. If a thief unlocked a phone using a stolen fingerprint, the way they interacted with the device often revealed the deception. These differences became forensic breadcrumbs, evidence of an intruder even when the physical fingerprint matched the device owner. In forensic labs, this opened new investigative avenues. Analysts began examining touch patterns on devices involved in crimes. A kidnapper's frantic swipes, a fraudster's calculated taps, a suspect's hurried attempts to erase data. Each behavior told a story. Combined with fingerprint residue and timestamps, these digital gestures became timelines in themselves. But fingerprint technology wasn't just evolving in the digital sphere. Scientists had begun experimenting with how fingerprints behaved under extreme conditions. Traditionally, fire, water, chemical damage, or time could destroy prints. But forensic chemists found ways to recover ridge patterns from burned wood, melted plastic, even decades-old items hidden in attics and basements. Vacuum metal deposition, a technique originally developed for manufacturing, allowed investigators to reveal prints on materials once thought impossible to examine, such as fabrics and porous surfaces. These breakthroughs revived cold cases, especially those involving long-buried evidence. In one case, a fingerprint lifted from a decades-old envelope led investigators to a suspect who had been confident his crimes were forgotten. In another, fingerprints on a charred piece of furniture, initially considered destroyed, provided the final link connecting a suspect to an arson murder. Each time a new technique emerged, detectives revisited old evidence with renewed hope. Yet while technology surged forward, the human element remained central. Fingerprint examiners, now working with far more complex tools than their predecessors, faced new challenges. AI-assisted systems could flag potential matches, but human oversight was crucial. Analysts had to understand where machine interpretation could falter: unusual print distortion, rare ridge formations, scars, age-related changes, or prints left under emotional duress. Prints taken during fear, cold, or exhaustion often appeared different from those taken under controlled conditions. Investigators learned to read the physical state of a suspect in the print itself. This complexity also created tension. As technology improved, the public assumed fingerprint identification was infallible. In reality, the process remained a careful blend of science, skill, and judgment. Examiners had to balance technological guidance with professional skepticism. Courts, meanwhile, demanded clearer explanations of how conclusions were reached. Fingerprints had become more powerful, but explaining that power had become more complicated. The expanding scope of fingerprint science also raised new ethical issues. As forensic databases grew, national systems, international exchanges, even private biometric systems, concerns surfaced about how fingerprint data was collected, stored, and shared. Some feared that allowing law enforcement access to commercial biometric systems, like those used by employers or phone manufacturers, would erode personal privacy. Others argued that restricting access hindered investigations into violent crimes. A global conversation emerged around biometric rights. Should fingerprints collected for everyday convenience be accessible to police with warrants? Should individuals be allowed to request deletion from certain databases? What about children, whose fingerprints change subtly over time? These debates shaped new policies and international agreements, reflecting a world struggling to balance innovation with personal freedom. Still, despite the philosophical and legal questions, fingerprints continued to evolve into something larger than their original purpose. They were no longer just markers of identity. They were portals into the habits, behaviors, environments, and digital interactions of a person's life. Each new discovery added a layer of depth. Each technological shift expanded the reach of forensic science. As the 21st century progressed, fingerprints had evolved into more than just a means of identifying suspects. They had become a window into the intricate interplay of biology, technology, and behavior. What began as smudges lifted from crime scenes now carried secrets about health, movement, lifestyle, and even psychological states. Part 10 examines the future-facing innovations, ethical dilemmas, and enduring power of fingerprints as they continue to shape both forensic science and society. By the 2020s, AI-assisted fingerprint analysis had reached unprecedented levels of precision. Algorithms could match partial prints that once would have been discarded, reconstructing missing ridge patterns and predicting unique minutiae with stunning accuracy. Forensics teams routinely use deep learning models to compare prints against vast databases, combining information about ridge flow, pore patterns, and even sweat residue chemistry. In some cases, the AI systems could identify prints obscured by dirt, moisture, or unusual pressure, creating possibilities for solving crimes that had been cold for decades. But these advancements also posed new challenges. The more precise the technology, the higher the stakes in court. Judges, juries, and attorneys demanded clear explanations of probabilistic models, error rates, and AI decision-making processes. A fingerprint match was no longer a simple yes or no answer. It was a statistical likelihood, often accompanied by a confidence interval. Forensic scientists had to become not only experts in fingerprint patterns but also interpreters of complex computational outputs, translating them into language understandable by the justice system. Alongside AI, researchers continued to explore fingerprints as a source of biochemical and physiological insight. Sweat residues, once seen only as traces for lifting prints, now provided detailed chemical fingerprints indicating substances the individual had recently consumed, exposure to toxins, or even elevated stress levels. Early studies showed that cortisol levels could be detected in ridge patterns, revealing whether a person was under significant emotional duress at the time of leaving a print. While this field was still emerging, it hinted at a future where fingerprints could be used to reconstruct not just the who of a crime, but the state of mind of the person involved. Fingerprints also became critical in the realm of cybersecurity and identity verification. In a world where digital transactions increasingly replaced cash, fingerprint authentication on smartphones, laptops, and payment systems became standard. High-level security systems combine traditional fingerprints with behavioral biometrics. The way someone swiped a phone, pressed keys, or navigated apps could supplement fingerprint data to prevent fraud. For law enforcement, this meant that digital devices could serve as repositories of fingerprint-based evidence, often revealing connections between physical crime scenes and online activity. Yet with these innovations came heightened privacy concerns. Critics warned that fingerprints, combined with AI and chemical analysis, could reveal far more about a person than anyone should know: health data, lifestyle habits, locations visited, and even stress responses. Governments and corporations wrestled with questions about storage, consent, and access. International treaties and local laws struggled to keep pace with rapidly evolving technology. Ethical debates emerged. Should a fingerprint collected for device security be admissible in a criminal investigation? How much personal information could be extracted without violating civil rights? Could insurance companies, employers, or other entities misuse fingerprint-derived health data? These questions define the next frontier of biometric ethics. Parallel to these societal concerns, forensic science continued to push technological boundaries. 3D fingerprint imaging and nanotechnology enabled investigators to lift prints from surfaces previously considered unusable, burned, submerged, or damaged beyond recognition. Nanoparticle powders that adhered selectively to fingerprint residue made hidden prints glow under specialized lighting, while laser-based imaging captured minute details invisible to the naked eye. Such techniques allowed for the reopening of cold cases, connecting suspects to crimes long thought unsolvable and bringing closure to victims' families decades later. Another major breakthrough came in multimodal biometric integration. Fingerprints no longer existed in isolation. They were combined with iris scans, facial recognition, voice prints, and even gait analysis to create a comprehensive identity profile. This integration increased accuracy exponentially, particularly in environments where a single biometric might be compromised or altered. For example, criminals attempting to alter their fingerprints surgically could still be identified through pore patterns, 3D ridge topography, and behavioral biometrics. Multimodal systems became a critical tool in counterterrorism, border security, and high-stakes criminal investigations worldwide. Interestingly, fingerprints also began to reveal insights in historical and archaeological contexts. Researchers studying ancient artifacts, historical documents, or old paintings discovered fingerprints that offered clues about age, gender, and occupation. Prints on centuries-old pottery revealed which individuals handled specific objects, while marks on manuscripts helped historians understand authorship and craftsmanship. Even as fingerprints became an indispensable modern forensic tool, they connected humanity to its past in a tangible, biological way. Despite these remarkable advances, the human element remained central. Fingerprint examiners, now skilled in chemistry, computer science, and AI interpretation, continued to provide critical judgment in cases where technology alone could not. They evaluated distortions caused by pressure, angle, or environmental conditions, interpreted chemical signatures, and ensured that evidence met rigorous standards of reliability. Technology amplified human expertise, but it did not replace it. Looking forward, the future of fingerprints promises even more extraordinary possibilities. Scientists are exploring ways to integrate fingerprints with biometric predictive analytics, attempting to understand behavioral trends and physiological states from ridge residue patterns. They are developing sensors capable of detecting instantaneous chemical changes, environmental exposures, and even interactions with objects that could serve as clues in future investigations. Fingerprints are moving from a simple identification method into a multidimensional forensic record, bridging physical, chemical, digital, and behavioral evidence. Ultimately, the story of fingerprints is a story of human ingenuity. From the first attempts to classify loops, whorls, and arches in dusty police stations, to the creation of global databases, to AI-assisted chemical analysis and multimodal biometric integration, fingerprints have continually adapted to meet the needs of society. They have survived attempts at forgery, evolved with technology, and expanded into fields unimaginable a century ago. Each print tells a story, not just of identity, but of presence, action, and sometimes even intent. Fingerprints have proven their enduring value because they are uniquely human. Unlike passwords, they cannot be easily forgotten. Unlike faces, they remain largely unchanged over a lifetime. Unlike digital codes, they cannot be hacked without leaving a trace. They connect the biological, the environmental, and the behavioral in a way no other forensic tool can. In a world of rapid technological change and increasing criminal sophistication, fingerprints remain an anchor, a reliable, tangible, and irreplaceable marker of who we are. In conclusion, fingerprints have not only changed crime solving, they have fundamentally reshaped it. From humble smudges in 19th century Europe to AI-driven, chemically analyzed, multimodal biometric records in the 21st century, fingerprints have endured, evolved, and expanded. They serve as a bridge between the past and the future, the physical and the digital, the human and the technological. They are proof that the smallest details, a ridge, a pore, a pattern, can hold the most profound truths. And so, as investigators, scientists, and legal experts continue to explore the limits of fingerprint science, one thing remains certain: the legacy of fingerprints is far from finished. They will continue to reveal the unseen, solve the unsolvable, and stand as one of humanity's most enduring tools in the quest for justice.